Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's presentation, which is being given by the wonderful Bret Charman about Australia. Before we begin, and I know that many of you have been on our presentations in the past, but before we begin, just a quick reminder that we have a question and answer session at the end of our evening. And you are very welcome to ask questions, which you can do by clicking on Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen and also on chat. And we will respond to those and answer your questions at the end of the evening. This evening's talk marks the end of our present series of talks. And we're going to pause for 2 or 3 weeks. And we will be bringing out a new series of talks, a thought and a request to you to see if there are any places that you would like us to talk about that we haven't yet spoken about, and also to see if there are any talks and presentations that we've given in the past that perhaps you've missed and that you would like us to put on again. But in the case of this evening, of course, we're chatting about Australia. Well, actually, Bret is chatting about Australia, as opposed to me. Surely one of the most lovely places on earth, isn't it, Bret? Wouldn't you think?
It's up there, definitely.
It's right up the top. And it's the sort of place, actually, which in some respects, I mean, there are so many people that don't really realise how lovely the wildlife is. And of course, it's beautiful, isn't it? Wherever you go in Australia.
It's amazing, yeah.
Wildlife-wise. So, hey, look, Bret, I'll leave it to you. I'll disappear and I'll chat to you at the end.
No problem. Thanks.
Cheers.
Cheers. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us yet again. And tonight I'm here to talk to you about Australia's wildlife. And many of you probably know that I'm a lover of Africa and obviously wildlife photography. But before I worked for Wildlife Worldwide, I actually took a year out to pursue wildlife photography, I guess, more seriously in Australia. So I moved to Australia for a year and I basically just photographed as much as I possibly could. The photographs you're going to see today are from sort of 3 states in Australia. So we've got Queensland, then we've got New South Wales and South Australia as well. So hopefully it will give you a really good oversight of the wildlife on the mainland of Australia. So I'm going to start off by kind of giving you an idea of the things you can see around hotels or rented accommodation or things like that, lodges as well, sort of within a really close proximity. So we're starting off sort of with, I guess, the wildlife that we find in the garden. But the wildlife in Australia is nothing like the wildlife we have in the UK, obviously. It's a little bit more exotic. It usually is a little bit more colourful, and sometimes it's a little bit more dangerous, but for the most part, that's not anything to worry about. So this is one of the most common birds in Australia. This is the rainbow lorikeet, and it is beautiful. And I genuinely mean they are everywhere. You see them with ease, and you don't have to work hard to find them at all. They are all around you, feeding on pretty much every type of plant you can imagine. They're very resourceful, and you'll see them in most people's gardens on a daily basis. They really are very special indeed. And there are lots of relatives of these amazing birds as well. This is a scaly-breasted lorikeet. It's a very close relative, another beautiful bird and a similar size. So think about sort of the ringneck parakeets you get in the UK. They're a similar size to that, really. But there's so much diversity in Australia, and I think that's one thing people don't appreciate. You know, everyone thinks of the iconic wildlife, the koalas and the kangaroos, but the bird life is spectacular. It's actually home to more species of parrot than any other country in the world, to give you an idea. But the bird life is incredibly high in levels of endemism, so they're found nowhere else on Earth, and that's the same for all of Australia's wildlife. The level of endemism is pretty much unmatched anywhere else in the world. It is incredible. It really is. And the variety of small birds to large birds, such as this is a pied currawong, beautiful bird, actually quite closely related to the birds of paradise in Papua New Guinea, would you believe it? But amazing birds, And just one of the many highlights, sulfur-crested cockatoos, these guys you will find everywhere in large flocks, family groups. They mate, and they're very sort of loyal to their mates as well. And they go through these amazing bonding processes. It really is incredible what you can see in such a short amount of time without having to sort of go on any big wildlife adventure. You can just see these things easily in towns and cities and country parks, even golf courses. If you ever want to find wildlife in Australia, go to a golf course. It's fantastic. It's great for kangaroos particularly. But of course, there are some famous species. So sulfur-crested cockatoos are one of the most sort of obvious species, but kookaburras, laughing kookaburras, the amazing sounds of Australia's bird life is really hard to beat. And it really is utterly magnificent to listen to the dawn chorus. You think the dawn chorus in the UK is better, go to Australia. It is incredible, particularly in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland in the subtemperate rainforest, subtropical, sorry, rainforest. Absolutely remarkable. Just a cacophony of noise. The kookaburras you quite often hear laughing, that amazing sort of iconic call. And then there's one of my favorite birds called the whipbird, which is just a delight to listen to. And honestly, I actually have an MP3, and sometimes I do just listen to it because it is so special. But it's not just the wildlife during the day and the bird life during the day, even in your garden at night, or around sort of towns and parks and things at night, there's wildlife again, whether it be things like this, a frogmouth, a tawny frogmouth, or mammal species as well, which we'll get onto. But you're always going to see stuff, from parrots to tiny little wrens, such as the superb and splendid fairy wrens. You know, there is so much diversity and so much beauty in the Australian bird life. And I have to say, I am not a birder at all. I'm primarily a mammal lover, and I love weird mammals in particular. So Australia is fantastic, but I couldn't help but become absolutely, well, head over heels. I fell head over heels in love with Australia's bird life. It really was absolutely spectacular. They even have robins. This is an eastern yellow bush robin, much like our robins in the UK. Follows you around the garden. It's actually a flycatcher, so it's slightly different in terms of family groups, but absolutely wonderful little birds, and a delight wherever you are on the eastern and southern coast. You'll get an amazing array of birds, including birds of prey too, and we'll get on to some of the coastal birds a little bit later on. But as I said, Australia's wildlife is fantastic at night as well. And one of the things I did was I went out with a torch pretty much every night and just walked around neighborhoods just to see what I could see. And the brush-tailed possum is quite possibly one of the most adaptable species on the Australian continent. And it is a continent, that's really important to say. It's got its own sort of, well, obviously its own biodiversity, but also sort of the climate and the weather patterns are pretty much unique to Australia. There's not really anywhere else like it. The east actually is very wet at certain times of the year. They get cyclones that come through, and you can get some quite heavy rainfalls. The further into the interior of Australia, obviously the drier it gets, the less forest cover, you get more scrub, mallee scrub, things like that. And then once you get down to the west again, the southwest, you get more forest cover, so Perth, Albany, places like that. So it really is an incredibly varied country. And even in the south, there's some amazing snowy peaks as well. So it's really a fantastic place to see an amazing set of landscapes at the same time as enjoying the incredible wildlife. Other wildlife that you can see really easily along sort of the east coast particularly are the flying mammals, the bats. Genuinely, some of the most incredible encounters I've ever had with mammals were with flying foxes, and they come and feed on, particularly on fig trees, and they will quite happily sit above you whilst sort of nibbling on food, and they quite often have a full tummy, and you can really see it sticking out from their sort of their beautiful thick fur. But they're inquisitive and they like to look at you. There used to be a great population in Sydney Botanic Gardens. Unfortunately, they decided to cull them recently in the last couple of years. So they're a little bit harder to see. But if you go out to any areas of the bush, particularly at dusk, you'll quite often see them flying over. And if anybody's ever interested in seeing an amazing spectacle of flying foxes, as you would in Zambia, you can go to an amazing place called Carnarvon Gorge. So I highly recommend that. As an exciting destination. It's pretty remote, but well worth it. So of course, more iconic Australian wildlife includes these guys, kangaroos. They're members of the macropod family. They are a marsupial, so they have a pouch, but they're a macropod. They basically have this fifth limb, this tail, and they pretty much rely on it for everything. It's pretty much the reason they are the shape they are is because of this strong, powerful tail. It helps them move, it helps them balance, and it helps them keep that incredibly efficient leaping that you can see. And the distances they can do in a single jump, a leap, is absolutely remarkable, and the speeds they can go is pretty astounding too. So these are eastern grey kangaroos, and these are found pretty much along the entire eastern seaboard until you get to the sort of tropical forests in sort of central Queensland, eastern central Queensland. But south of that, all the way to sort of the southern tip, Melbourne way, you'll get eastern grey kangaroos. And then to the west of that, it starts to change and you get western grey kangaroos. And we'll see one of those in a little bit, and hopefully you can see the difference between them. But the eastern grey kangaroo is a bit like the brush-tailed possum, one of the most adaptable of species. In fact, they're so successful that they now love golf courses, they love gardens, they love city parks, and they are incredibly easy to approach. Don't get me wrong, they are a large mammal, so you have to treat them with respect. Don't get too close to them. But once you start to work with them, you can gain their trust after a couple of hours even, and you can really build up an amazing array of imagery if you're interested in that, or you can just sit and enjoy some of the best wildlife encounters you can really have. From youngsters such as this gorgeous little young grey kangaroo, to the large adults as well. You can get within a few meters at times, but let them come to you, don't approach them. To give you an idea, this is taken on a wide angle lens, about, I think it's 24mm. And you can see the kangaroos are completely relaxed. If you're wondering what the water is behind them, it's actually a river channel with mangrove swamps on the other side. So it's sort of an estuarine habitat, and they're feeding on this sort of grassy foreshore area, basically. So the coastline is where most of Australia's people live, and it's home to an awful lot of the wildlife as well, this eastern seaboard. And then you've got an area called the hinterland, and then you've got the red centre sort of beyond that to the west. So as you go away from the coastline, you start to see some different species, but you get some species that will go throughout, and that includes the kangaroos, the wallabies, such as this. This is a swamp wallaby, and again, the variety of the wallabies, you quite often get the same species, and they journey over huge areas in terms of sort of distribution, I should say, sorry. Their distribution is quite remarkable, and they look different in each area you visit, which is pretty special in itself. So, but the swamp wallaby is one of my favorite, most charismatic, this little cutie. And then one of the most common species spread across the eastern coast and down into Tasmania is the Bennett's wallaby, or the red-necked wallaby, as it's known on the mainland. And these, again, are very approachable. And if you go to a nature reserve, absolutely fantastic. One of the things I like to say about visiting the east coast of Australia is there are some very famous national parks. But a lot of the time, the wildlife in these national parks is quite hard to see, and that's because of the high numbers of tourists. So what we can do is basically look at the national parks that are sort of recommended as places to visit, read about the wildlife, and then look on a map. And usually there's another national park 3 or 4 miles away, which has no visitors and has all the wildlife, and you can walk among it. It's really quite spectacular. And that's what I spent my time doing. And one of the species I was desperate to see was the platypus. I mean, there's not really much of a weirder mammal out there than the platypus. For starters, it lays eggs, which is pretty unique. It's a monotreme, which means it's an egg-laying mammal. It obviously has that bizarre duck-like bill that it's famous for. It has the tail of a beaver. It has completely webbed feet. It has a poisonous spur on its back legs. And sorry, I should say venomous spur, not poisonous. And just to top it all off, it doesn't sort of feed its young with milk in the traditional sense using teats. It actually just leaks it through the skin. So the babies can just choose where they suckle and milk just comes out of its skin. It really is a truly bizarre species. And the reason it's a mammal is because of that milk production ability. So it is unlike anything else. And this photograph here was actually quite a great story behind it. I'd been in a national park specifically looking for platypus and came across a gentleman who was sitting on a rock by this creek, and it was perfect platypus habitat. And I said to him, "Oh, have you seen any platypus here?" And he goes, "No, I've been here for a few days. I've had no luck and I'm just about to leave." And he said, "Oh," I said, "Oh, well, I'm looking for them." He said, "Oh, well, I wish you the best of luck. I hope you have more luck than me." Anyway, he walked off through the forest and I'm sat on this rock. And within probably 30 seconds, I'm not even joking, a platypus popped up in front of me. So I went back the next day thinking there's no chance I'm going to see it again. And to my amazement, the platypus actually came up even closer right in front of me. To give you an idea, these images are taken with a 300mm lens, so not a huge telephoto lens, sort of a medium range one. And it literally came up right in front of me, and I watched it for the next couple of hours, and it was just the most amazing thing to see a platypus in broad daylight, less than 5 meters away. Well, at times was 5 meters away. These photographs are probably maybe 5 to 10 meters, something like that. So it really is an amazing animal and a real privilege to see these incredible things. By the time I left Australia, I'd actually seen platypus all up the eastern seaboard. So I was very lucky. I saw them in numerous different river systems, numerous different habitats. And that was something that amazed me, was actually the variety of habitats that the platypus have colonized. As long as they've got banks and a reliable water source, they're very, very successful, as long as they're not disturbed, obviously. So the monotremes is just one of the weird and wonderful wildlife of Australia. The monotremes particularly, the other is this. This is the short-beaked echidna. Like the platypus, it lays eggs. It's also known as the spiny anteater, and you can see why. It's very much like a hedgehog, that convergent evolution you get, but it's basically only eats ants and termites. So these guys are really, really fantastic little thing. 99% of their diet is invertebrates. Occasionally they will eat other things, but that isn't really what they're going after. It might just be a bycatch. But they have this long sticky tongue, and they will dig out the nests, and then they will feed on the young, the larvae, and the adults as well. And what's amazing is about the echidna is that they actually have backwards facing rear feet. So they really are a bizarre creature, another oddity like the platypus. But again, very, very approachable. This was less than 3 meters away. And actually, I was laying on the floor, and this platypus, I'm not even joking, this echidna walked straight over my legs. So Australia is fantastic, not only for the weird wildlife, the fantastic birds, but most of the wildlife doesn't have a fear of people. And that's a real treat, particularly for a wildlife photographer. But just, when you're used to living in the UK and places in Europe, the wildlife is usually afraid of you. So to get this incredible sort of intimacy with these species, it is a real treat. Other species that are sort of iconic, I suppose, include the koala. And again, the sort of variety in their appearance is quite remarkable. When you go further south, and this one is taken right in the south on Kangaroo Island in the southwest and South Australia, and they are big and fluffy. If you go up to Queensland and northern New South Wales, they're quite small, quite petite, and very short-haired in comparison. The coloration, they're usually slightly browner in the south and sort of a lighter grey further north. So there is this amazing diversity of individual species, as well as the habitats and the different species as well. It really is just a mind-blowing destination for anybody with a passion for wildlife. And I have to say, I really do sort of seek out the weird and wonderful wildlife. So for me, Australia couldn't have been a better destination to go. Another marsupial is the wombat. There again are several different species, and again they can be incredibly habituated to people. On this particular day, I was exploring an area called Kangaroo Valley, and ironically, as well as seeing lots of kangaroos, we saw an awful lot of wombats and kookaburras too. And the wombats are basically making the most of a campground here along a river. It's a beautiful river, also a good place for platypus. And what they're doing is they're feeding on that lovely fresh grass that is mowed regularly for the campers. And if you go outside of holiday season in Australia, it really is a spectacular place to explore. Again, the wombats have no fear, so you can expect amazing close encounters. And I've actually got some videos taken on my mobile phone, and it fills up the entire screen. They really are that approachable. But these guys can be quite feisty, so you do need to give them respect. Again, let them approach you, don't approach them. And when they come close, just don't move suddenly, keep quiet, etc., and they'll be absolutely fine. just remarkable diversity of just the sheer variety of species is mind-blowing, and I genuinely can't praise or rave about Australian wildlife enough. It really is that special. I try and say to people that Australia isn't just about the wildlife. There are some of the most beautiful landscapes I've been anywhere in the world, and I have to admit, my primary passion in life, my favorite places to go are in Africa, partly because the landscapes are so spectacular, but also because of the wildlife, obviously. Australia, when I went there, I kind of went not knowing what I was going to encounter. And I have to say, it's within very much so within my top 5 destinations to visit, both from a wildlife point of view and just from the staggering natural beauty. And this is a wonderful little national park called Dorrigo National Park. It's not got sort of a huge area to explore, I suppose. It's quite a small national park, but it's a fantastic place to see lyrebirds, one of the most amazing songsters of the bird world. And it's also fantastic for waterfalls and for sort of ancient forests. And it really is very special. Just get out there and explore, and it is worth every single second. One of the top places, without a doubt, for people to visit, particularly on the eastern seaboard of Australia, is Fraser Island. It's the largest sand island on Earth. It's only got a few inhabitants on it, permanent residents, I should say, and it's home, they believe, to the most pure genetic dingoes, purebred genetic dingoes. And basically, on the mainland, dingoes have been crossbreeding with domestic dogs, so that genetic lineage has been disturbed, damaged, I suppose. And the dingo is descended from dogs, they believe, in Indonesia. And they were brought over probably for food by the first indigenous populations. And they have been here on the Australian continent for thousands and thousands of years, and now play a key role as a keystone species. They are an apex predator. They keep lots of species under control. And unfortunately, on the mainland, they are disappearing, primarily due to human wildlife conflict, particularly predating on sheep and things like that on outback stations. But they really do play a key role. And it's actually been discovered that they predate on kangaroos more than sheep on these outback stations. And they can actually increase the biodiversity in the station and increase the quality of grazing for those sheep. So it's a very complex story, but very fascinating. I can go on all night, but I won't. But when I went to Fraser Island, I had heard huge amounts of stories about dingoes had stolen children from the beach, and they were dangerous and they attack you. And, you know, they are an apex predator. So you go, I guess, with a bit of hesitancy, not knowing what to expect. And I self-drove around the island, which was quite an adventure in itself. And it's very much an off-road destination, I should say. The roads are sand and incredibly tough going, but they are worth every second again. And I was walking along a beach one night photographing the sunset, and I turned around to see a dingo watching me, this beautiful, beautiful dingo. And it was one of the best wildlife encounters I've ever had, to see a wild predator watching you on foot with no hostility, no anxiety, and you just have this mutual respect for one another. That is the ultimate wildlife encounter for me. And over the course of a few days, I ended up sort of spending time with a couple of different packs, and some were a lot more approachable than others, but I always let them come towards me. And in the end, I got to spend some time with this beautiful family that had these sort of growing pups, and they're beautiful russet front, and then these ones had a black back. And there can be a lot of variety in dingoes. I think most people just think there's beautiful sort of tan, reddish color, ochre color, but actually there's quite a lot of variety. Some are completely black, particularly in the Alps, actually the Australian Alps, the snowy mountains. There's some fantastic sort of colorations of dingoes, but the sort of standard is this rich russet orange coat. But this is the male, this is the father of the pup you just saw, and you can see he's actually got black along his back. And one of the things I wanted to do when I was photographing these guys was try and change people's perceptions, because they've got such a bad reputation in Australia. So anyway, I worked and worked and worked, and I eventually was rewarded with this image of this female as she was resting in the shade of a palm grove, and she was just sort of using the shade from the palm leaves to keep cool. The sand was nice and cool, so she moved some of the leaves and just sort of rested in the sand. And I managed to get this sort of really dreamy sort of depth of field to this shot. And actually, it was a winner in Australian Nature Photographer of the Year. And one of the reasons it was a winner was because the judges said it changed people's perceptions of what was deemed to be a scary predator. And for me, that was a really amazing moment, was to sort of hopefully open some people's eyes to this amazing species and not think of it as a feral dog, because it most definitely isn't. They are really, really special. But again, there is so much more on offer, whether you're in Kangaroo Island, or you're exploring around the Melbourne area in the south, or you're on the Sunshine Coast, Fraser Island, places like that, or even if you go north up to Eucalypt, Lamington National Park, which is near Brisbane, or Daintree up near Cairns. There's so much on offer. This little guy is a Tamar wallaby, and it is a cutie. It's not much bigger than the size of a domestic cat. It's really charismatic and very, very approachable once more. These guys are found on Kangaroo Island and in a very few isolated pockets in South Australia. But I told you earlier about the Western grey kangaroo. Actually, it's this guy here to my right, might be to your left on the screen. But basically, this is the Western grey kangaroo. Number one, is not that grey, they're more of a browny colour, and they've got this dark face with this lighter front, so they've got quite a distinct appearance from the eastern grey kangaroos, and they are a different species, so that's important to note, but they live in much the same habitat for the most part, and it's quite interesting to see this divide, and there really is a dividing line of where the species live, so it's important to be aware that there are these different grey kangaroos, there's not just one. And of course, the most famous species of kangaroo in Australia is the red kangaroo. And I actually went to a specific park in New South Wales to find these guys. I actually had a Vauxhall Astra. It had very bad suspension. And I drove around Australia, and I did 80,000 kilometers in it. So I did quite a lot of driving in the time I was there. And basically, we went to this place called Mungo National Park to see red kangaroos, because all the other places I'd been that they were supposed to be, I hadn't seen any. Anyway, what I quite quickly learned was that only the males are red, and the females are, like the smaller kangaroo here, a sort of a bluey grey colour. So when you think of red kangaroos, they're not all red, only the big males. And you can see the size difference. The one to the right is a female, and the one to the left is obviously the male. And you can actually probably see he's puffed himself up. And the red kangaroos can be quite aggressive, particularly the males, and they will protect their interests, their females. So don't approach them too closely, because they will definitely win a fight. He thinks he's a bodybuilder. I think he's sort of really pumped himself up, making himself look very tough indeed. But amazing to see. And these sort of areas, this mallee scrub, and sort of the sort of semi-desert regions are fantastic for things like wedge-tailed eagles as well. There really is a huge amount of life, and this is where I'm going to take a sort of a bit of an abstract approach to wildlife, just in the sense that most people focus on the mammals and the birds, but Australia has a whole other world to explore, and that is the cold-blooded world. This is a frilled lizard. These guys are the ones that you see that sort of stick their necks out, this beautiful vivid orange color, and it's to ward off predators. This is actually a youngster, and so he's relying on his camouflage to keep him hidden, but they can be quite aggressive, and they will run at you, particularly the adults, if they feel threatened. But you have nothing to fear. They won't do anything really, and the small ones like this will quite happily sit. But I absolutely fell in love with the cold-blooded species of Australia. This guy is an ocellated velvet gecko. It's quite a name, but it's absolutely beautiful. I don't know if anybody's ever had leopard geckos as pets or seen them in pet shops. It's a very similar size, only found in the sort of the interior in Queensland, in the hinterland, in the desert regions. And there's just so much on offer for those that love cold-blooded species. This is a water dragon. If you ever in Sydney go to the Botanic Gardens, you'll see these guys by the fountains and the ponds. They're everywhere, absolutely amazing. And of course, there are snakes. Apologies if nobody likes snakes, but they are an important thing in Australia. And actually, don't be afraid, because I was in Australia for a year and I actively looked for snakes. And to be honest, they're really hard to find. So you have to work pretty hard for the most part to find snakes, unless you go to Tasmania, and then they're quite easy to see because the temperature is much cooler. In most of Australia, particularly if you go in the spring, summer, autumn, you don't really have to worry because it's so warm. They slither away during the middle of the day, and you're unlikely to encounter them. This guy's a carpet python. He's about 3 meters long. Absolutely no risk to me at all. Just a beautiful, beautiful animal. And he's actually sheltering in the bough of a tree during a cyclone rainstorm. And so he's sort of trying to conserve his body heat. That's why he's beautifully shiny, because he's very wet. And yeah, absolutely amazing snake. But the thing I really fell in love with in Australia were frogs. And I'm going to spend a few minutes now boring you with endless pictures of frogs. But number one, because I think everyone thinks of Australia as a dry climate, you don't associate Australia with frogs. You think of reptiles and snakes, lizards, but the frog variety, diversity in Australia is truly astounding. This is a green tree frog, an amazing species, and they love to inhabit toilets and drain pipes and water butts, and they love it because they resonate the sound, and obviously they're damp. So they call and they sound a bit like a foghorn going off, sort of a whoop, and a very charismatic little thing. Well, quite a big thing, that palm of your hand quite easily. But please don't pick them up because your sort of salty skin is bad for them. But they're amazing. And actually, Australia's home to the largest species of tree frog. And this is this guy. This is a white-lipped tree frog, or a giant tree frog. Think of the size of a medium dinner plate. It's truly gargantuan. It is absolutely amazing. And this guy actually decided to jump on my face, and it really did feel like being hit around the face with a wet fish, to be honest. It was quite a bizarre sensation. But to give you an idea of the scale of these things, they are hefty. So I don't know if anyone's ever seen a cane toad, a full-size cane toad. They're pretty big. They're bigger than those, and they really are incredibly loud, and you can hear them from 50 meters in a rainforest through all the other sounds, and you'll just hear them calling. And they change color as well, which is even more exciting. So you can see here he's got these massive red feet, this big white lip. A white lip tree frog is very apt. And in this picture, he's quite brown. The same frog, only moments later, turned a very vivid green. And you might be wondering what's on his head. It's a mosquito, and they do like frogs as much as they like people. I don't know whether they get itches though, I'm afraid. I wasn't able to tell. But they are an amazing species of white-lipped tree frog. And this last photograph I just took to kind of make it seem grand and sort of worthy of its name, the giant tree frog. But there are so many more species on offer. This is called the dainty tree frog, and I think you can see why. It's got sort of very pretty face, very pronounced, but these incredible eyes. And that's one thing I noticed about the frogs, was the sort of the coloration of their eyes and the patterns. But of course the calls are fantastic, and here you can actually see his feet through the vocal sac of this dainty tree frog, if you look closely. So there is so much on offer in this froggy world. And from size of that giant tree frog that I told you, the size of a medium dinner plate, this is an eastern dwarf sedge frog, or tree frog. And this is only about the size of a 10p coin, to give you an idea. And its feet are completely translucent because it's so small. So it gives you an idea of the variety. But my favorite species is the red-eyed tree frog. And if anybody's ever been to Costa Rica, I bet you're saying, oh, well, I've seen a red-eyed tree frog there. They look the same. Well, there's one important difference. In red-eyed tree frogs, pupils, when they sort of constrict, will go vertically. And on the red-eyed tree frog in Australia, and also the orange-eyed tree frog in Australia, they go horizontally. So you can see it narrows that way instead of the sort of the vertical iris. So it's very interesting how you get sort of the change in species, but sort of the appearance is very, very similar. And I was just playing around, really trying to get pictures of them, and they're quite common in northern New South Wales, Queensland, up to sort of northern Queensland, but quite hard to see, although they're particularly common. And then this was my favorite photograph of a reflection on the leaf. So there really is a huge variety. And I talked about the pupils, obviously, on the red-eyed tree frog there. This guy is a an emerald spotted, tree frog. You might be able to see little green dots. They look like pondweed on his skin, but they're not. That is actually a bizarre sort of iridescent skin coloration. And then it's got this beautiful cross pattern across its iris, which is quite bizarre, but not that uncommon. So it's not all about the cold-blooded stuff. It's not all about the garden birds. There's so much more obviously on offer, and the habitats are always changing too. If you go to the Murray River, for example, it's a fantastic place for water birds, and the coastline as well is absolutely exceptional. This is a black swan, as was the previous picture, on the Murray River at dawn. Beautiful mists, particularly if you go in the autumn or in the winter months. It's nice and cool, and you get the cold air descending down onto the river. Absolutely spectacular. It's a great time to see large flocks of parrots flying in to have a drink in the morning, from things like galah, which are very common. And then kookaburras too are often along the waterlines. They are obviously a species of kingfisher, but their diet is a lot more varied. So think lizards, they will eat fish, but more likely lizards, centipedes, invertebrates, things like that. Even small mammals they will catch, but they're a pretty sizable bird. And obviously that call is always going throughout. The frogmouths too love going along this watery habitat because the amount of life that sort of is found alongside it. And another member of the lorikeet family, a musk lorikeet, and they love going for the flowering plants that love to sit on the banks of the river systems. But it's the coast for me, I think, that probably is sort of, well, I guess it's the most obvious feature in Australia. It's such a huge coastline, but it has so much variety, not only because of the sort of the land mammals that visit, but you've got the land birds on the shoreline, and then you've got the water birds in the tidal zone, and then you've got the seabirds as well, and the sea life that goes with that once you get out onto the water. But you get sort of species that you would see in the UK, from bar-tailed godwit, black-tailed godwit as well. They have eastern curlews. There's so much on offer on the mudflats, things that we don't get in the UK and Europe, such as masked lapwings. And you might see on this individual, it's got a little prehistoric spur coming out of its wing, a little thumb sort of sticking out, which is pretty unusual and quite remarkable. Think of the Hoatzin with that weird hook from South America. But you can see the landscapes along the coast are just as spectacular as they are on land. And again, more familiar species such as black-winged stilt, but slightly different appearances. And this might look very much like our own stone curlew, but it's actually a beach stone curlew from Australia, and it's actually a very rare species now, unfortunately due to sort of conurbations destroying much of its habitat. But things that look similar aren't necessarily the same. So this oyster catcher looks almost identical to our own species, but is actually a completely different species. And then there are some really special birds which are pretty common but amazing to see. This is a long-tailed kite. This is a whistling kite, and they love to come down along the beaches and grab sort of things from the seashore. They don't often land. Think about a red kite coming down and swooping for roadkill and things like that. They very rarely sit on the ground. It's the same for the whistling kite. They swoop in, grab things, and fly off. But on this particular occasion, I spent about 2.5 hours, 3 hours crawling across these awful sticky mudflats, getting bitten by sandflies. And eventually was rewarded with this, and it's actually on a vertebrae of an animal, and I've not so far been able to ascertain what species, but it gives you an idea of sort of the amazing wildlife on the coastline. And if you go during cyclone season, you can be rewarded with some spectacular skies, such as this is the lightning storm over Moreton Bay, which is just north of Brisbane. But again, more similar species to those we get in the UK. This is obviously the same. This is an osprey. Another oyster catch for you, but they also have their own versions of our birds, and that's obviously because being an ex-colonial outpost, we weren't very inventive with lots of names, so we just sort of renamed birds that look similar. So this is an Australian magpie, and if you ever want to listen to a spectacular bird call, go on YouTube or whatever your preferred sound or video provider is, and type in Australian magpie call, because they have this sort of bizarre synthesizer, metallic sounding call. One of the most spectacular songs of any bird I've ever heard anywhere in the world. And yet Australians hate them because they are known for dive bombing. But again, they're incredibly inquisitive, and they'll come right up to you. This is taken with a 17mm lens, ultra wide angle, to give you an idea. So they have absolutely no fear of people. The seabird life is spectacular, from crested terns, Australian pelicans galore. Seriously, the diversity of terns is remarkable. It really, really is. And pigeons as well, unlike you've ever seen. This is a crested pigeon, but if you go inland, you get spinifex pigeons. And of course, that coastline, those landscapes, And one of the things, actually, I was just talking to Chris before we came on air, so to speak, and the lighting in Australia is up there with the very best in the world. Sunsets are sublime, sunrises are remarkable, and the coastline is heavenly. It really is. And this is actually in New South Wales. It's near a place called Seal Rocks, and it's an amazing place called Sugarloaf Lighthouse, Sugarloaf Point. And I was very lucky with a long exposure and amazing light. No photoshopping involved at all in this, just to let you know. It really is very special indeed. But of course, this coastline is just home to endless different species. Some are endemic, some are not, some are migrants. This is a white-faced heron. This gorgeous little bird is a sooty oyster catcher, and they dive in and out of the waves trying to catch invertebrates and mollusks from the rocky foreshore. Quite a hard bird to see, but if you spend a bit of time, you can get quite lucky and get quite close. But fantastic bird watching all along the coast. And again, that amazing coastal landscape. This is in a very different location. This is actually in sort of the southwestern tip of southern Australia, called Robe. And this is Robe Obelisk. They didn't have a lighthouse, so they just stuck a large stony structure and painted it in lighthouse colours. But it's around these sort of coastal areas that you're likely to see marine mammals as well, from Australian fur seals to the New Zealand fur seal. And these guys, again, can be incredibly approachable if you find colonies. So if you go to Kangaroo Island, for example, in South Australia, you can get very close. There's a few places south of Sydney that are very good as well. And then on Kangaroo Island as well, there's this amazing colony of Australian sea lions, which are now very rare. But you can go on guided tours and walk through them. And genuinely, it's one of the best seal encounters I've ever had. You can see pups in the dunes, adults on the beaches. You can see them surfing in the crystal clear waters. It's just an amazing place. It really is. And along the eastern seaboard in particular is a fantastic place to go whale watching. Hervey Bay in Queensland, Sydney even, you can get some fantastic whale watching. It really is an all-round remarkable place. And some of you might be familiar with this scene. It's on the Great Ocean Road. It's actually called London Bridge. And this peninsula here, this rocky outcrop, actually used to be connected to the mainland, and people used to walk onto it. And it just so happened that on a day when some people were on the headland, the arch that sort of joined the two together collapsed and left, I think it was about 12 people stuck on the headland. Luckily, nobody was hurt and all were evacuated. But it's around here and closer to Melbourne where you can see the fairy penguin, or the little penguin, the smallest species of penguin in the world. And actually, only about a minute after I took this photograph, pairs of fairy penguins appeared from the surf and were running up the beach. It was really, really special. Very hard to photograph because it was nearly dark, but nonetheless, absolutely remarkable. And I'm just going to leave you here with just some of my favorite photographs from the trip, from my time in Australia anyway. And this is an Australian pelican, and it's a reflection, obviously, in the water. Amazing crystal clear, still water, very shallow, with a beautiful soft sunset going off sort of diagonally to its left. And the light just got better and better. And as I was photographing these birds, I heard the wing beats of another bird flying in. And then I know many of you have seen this photograph before, but I was left with this photograph of a pelican coming into land. And yeah, this is probably my favorite picture from my time down under. And the sad thing is that I very nearly didn't know I had it because I hadn't actually sort of checked my memory cards on my computer. And it was only a few weeks after I took the photograph that I discovered it. And yes, I'm quite glad I did. But anyway, that's sort of a quick overview of the eastern and southern reaches of Australia. And if you have any questions at all, I know some of you already sent some through, please do send them across, and we'll answer them. And also, if you want a brochure, you can order it through our website. And if you have any questions, my email address is there. So do get in touch if at a later date, if necessary. So thank you very much for listening, and we really, really appreciate it.
Hey Bret, that was absolutely fantastic. I mean, it was an almost breathless, high-speed whiz around the wildlife of the eastern and southern coast.
Yeah.
Absolutely stunning, man. That was just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Wonderful photography as usual.
Thank you.
Hey, before we came on air, as you said, you and I were chatting, and I was asking about the yellow colour in the background of this kangaroo. I think it'd be good to explain, because I was saying when we were chatting earlier, it almost looks like the yellow of the rape flowers that are in the fields at the moment, which it is.
So it's actually the picture I showed earlier on with the wide angle with all the kangaroos sort of in front of me. There was that water channel behind it, and then there was the mangrove vegetation in the background. And basically what's happening is the sun was setting to my left, the kangaroo is in shadow, and the sunset is reflecting off the water and off the leaves, and produce this beautiful rich golden color. So it's completely natural. It's not photoshopped. It's just a weird oddity of light.
But like you were saying, like we were saying, there's something very special about the light in Australia, isn't there?
Yeah. It's partly to do with the dust.
Well, there is that, I guess.
It's rich. It's and I think because they get so much sunshine as well, everything does get a nice hue to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. So hey, look, as you said, we've had a number of questions come through. I think perhaps before we go on to the questions that come through, do you want to say something about weather and climate and stuff? Because that's quite important, isn't it? And it's quite variable in Oz.
I think that's one of the things that probably surprised me the most, really, living there. I mean, I camped a lot when I was there, and the coldest I camped in was -10, and the warmest I camped in was 44.
Yeah, and they could be on consecutive nights depending on where you are.
It depends where you're going massively. So, like Southern Australia, for example, it's very much like the UK. It's a very temperate climate, but with warm summers. So summers, I would say, range between 25 and 40 degrees. Winters range between literally 0, -5, up to 10, 15 degrees. It depends on the day. You can get a cold day, then you can get a warm day. Also depends on the Southern Ocean and what that's doing. That's quite an important factor. So Tasmania, for example, gets pretty cold winters, and that's because it's exposed to the currents of the Southern Ocean. But then the eastern seaboard, the winters are quite sunny and mild for the most part. I mean, they all wear fleeces and winter jackets when it's 10 degrees, but and they think that's a freezing cold day. But they do, if you go up into the mountains, it's cold, definitely. And they get snow every year in the snowy mountains, obviously. And then the further north you go, obviously the warmer it gets and the more humid it gets, because it turns from subtropical to tropical. And then the time of year makes a massive difference. So in winter, in the north, which is obviously our summer, daytime temperatures 20 quite comfortably, up to 30 degrees the further north you go. And then summer temperatures, the further north you go, it's pretty stable all year, but the humidity changes. And then in the summer months it can be very hot, obviously, so you can hit 45 degrees, particularly away from the coast. It can be pretty sort of relentless. So I usually suggest visiting in spring or autumn, just because it's kind of the best of both worlds. Spring's a great time because lots of the animals are giving birth, and it's after the winter, so they've had a bit of rain. But it really depends. But also the rains are different in each part of Australia, so it's really complicated.
And I think it's probably fair to say that any month of the year that you went to Australia, you will be able to find the kind of weather that you want. If you want any weather, you'll find it. If you want
100%. I mean, like, for example, you don't want to go to the Kimberley or sort of Darwin area, Northern Territories in summer, because it's about 99% humidity and 35 degrees, 40 degrees. So it's unbearable. So you want to go there in the winter, but then you want to go to the south probably in the summer. Pretty much any time of year you want to go to Australia, there's a habitat or a climate and wildlife that's perfect for you. It really depends what you're interested in when you want to go. And obviously you can combine it with New Zealand and places like that as well. So absolutely. Well, it's good combination with New Zealand and so on.
So okay, so that's weather and climate. What about accommodation? We normally touch on accommodation a little bit, don't we? I mean, accommodation in Australia can be tremendous. I mean, I know I've also camped a lot in Australia, and it's brilliant, and highly recommend it. But it's not for everyone.
No, it's not. So yeah, incredibly varied again, from really high-end private lodges on private reserves sometimes.
Yeah.
There's a great collection of lodges actually, the most famous of which is the Southern Ocean Lodge, which unfortunately burnt down in the awful fires on Kangaroo Island, but they are rebuilding it, so that's fantastic. I think it's meant to be ready for next year actually, so that's really good. But there's a whole collection basically spread across Australia of really beautiful lodges. Some of them work in partnership and some of them are completely independent. Around the Brisbane area, there's some brilliant lodges up in the rainforests. All along the eastern coastline, there's just some amazing places to stay. And then there's some really affordable places to stay as well. So it really is something suitable budget. And if you want to do a self-drive or even like a camper van trip, that's a great way to do it, because campsites in Australia aren't like British campsites. They have kitchens and barbecues provided and swimming pools, and it's very civilized.
They do it very well, don't they?
Yeah.
They do it very well. They absolutely they know what they want, and they know what everyone wants, and they make it happen. And of course, again, worth saying that a lot of the accommodations on some of these big private estates, private reserves, you know, the cattle stations and so on.
Yeah.
Some of the accommodation is super and very influenced by the kind of thing that we see in Southern Africa and East Africa.
It's almost a copy, I'd say. Even places sort of up in the Kimberley and up in sort of the Northern Territories, Kakadu and places, that they are very much based on an African bush camp almost.
Yeah, lots of them are, and some of them are really. I mean, they're fantastic.
I mean, Southern Ocean Lodge I think was voted 3 years in a row the world's #1 lodge.
Yeah. So, which lodge was that?
Southern Ocean.
Oh, the one that burnt down.
Yeah, it was meant to be because of the views and the wildlife and the guides and the food, and I mean, it's amazing. So,
wow. Okay, well that's good. And it was kind of interesting because we had a question from. Let me find it. We had a question at 7:43 from Loretta, who says, "I love weird mammals too." You were talking about weird mammals.
Yeah.
What do you think's the world's weirdest? Eye-eye's got to be pretty close, isn't it?
What's that? Sorry.
An eye-eye's got to be.
Eye-eye's pretty close, yeah. Even in Australia, though, there's some pretty bizarre things. Other things like a bilby, for example.
Yeah.
It looks like a cross between an elephant, a shrew, and a rabbit. So I mean, that's a pretty weird combination. And a kangaroo, actually, it's kind of a mix of those 4 things.
Yeah. Well, even a kangaroo is a peculiar animal.
Yeah, the giant armadillo is a pretty good one as well.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of good options. Maybe we should.
But I think Australia's home to sort of the highest number of weird mammals in one place.
Right. Yeah, I think you're probably right. So Neil says he's booked to go on a Tasmania trip, or to go on our Tasmania trip, and would like to add Kangaroo Island as an extension, which I wholeheartedly support that.
Yeah.
Would you advise that he goes before or after Tassie?
What time of year is that?
Well, Tassie will be. I don't know exactly what time Neil's going. Not immediately, obviously, if Neil's on our trip. I'm guessing it's going to be sometime between November and February.
Yeah, I don't know which one he's on, so that's the issue. But it honestly either would be amazing.
Difference, is it?
I mean, if you go probably after, for example, you'll probably get the sea lions pupping on the beach. The bird life's pretty much amazing all year round, as is the mammal life. If you go in the spring, it's going to have come to life. So before the photography tour, there might be more sort of breeding birds perhaps and things like that. But honestly, Kangaroo Island, I went in midwinter and I had an absolutely amazing time. I mean, it was freezing cold, but it was epic. So I mean, we had a Tamar wallaby try and climb in our tent, so it's
fantastic.
So it's pretty amazing place to go.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds good. And what about the chances of being cassowary in the Daintree?
Hard. really. There's one beach called Rainbow Beach, which is north of Cairns, and that's your best bet of seeing cassowary because they come into the town. And they feed on the fruiting trees underneath along the sort of the promenade. I mean, it's not really a town. It's what Australia calls a town. It's a village.
Yes, of course. Yeah. They
Yeah.
probably call it a city then in that case.
Yeah, but it's just a little cove surrounded by rainforest, basically. That's your most reliable place that I know of in sort of the Daintree area, the Daintree ecosystem.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, fair
So I
enough.
think it's about 20 minutes north of Cairns. So pretty close
So
by.
yeah, okay. It's not a place that I know. So Janet says, how does Tasmania compare? Should we visit both places, or should I visit Tasmania instead? I know exactly what your answer is going to be, but I'm going to let you. Huh?
If you can visit both, then yes, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, Tasmania is a microcosm of Australia, is probably the best way to put it. Everything you've seen is pretty much found on Tasmania, barring dingoes, and some of the sort of the frogs. You don't really get the same diversity, obviously, but so many of the species you get on mainland Australia are also in Tasmania. Plus, you also get Tasmanian devil, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And there are some sort of birds that you're less likely to see on the mainland that you'll see in Tasmania, just because there's a much larger amount of sort of traditional forest, I suppose is the way to put it.
Yeah, yeah. Particularly down in the southwest, of course.
Southwest, and even the northeast, actually. There's some amazing forests still. It's a huge wilderness area.
It's fantastic. I love it.
It's one of the least sort of disturbed places on earth. So
yeah, and particularly nice wines come from Tasmania.
Yeah, and the food in Tasmania is amazing.
Yeah, it's very, very good, isn't it? Hey, a couple of people have asked about spiders in Australia.
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't put any spider pictures in my presentation because otherwise people won't come back, I think. But yeah, so I mean, they are there. The most common species you will see in Australia is a huntsman. It's pretty harmless to people. Like it's like a spider bite in the UK. It might hurt when you get bitten, and unless you have an allergic reaction, you'll be absolutely fine. But they're just quite big, so I think they just freak people out, and they like to sort of run quite quickly because they're sort of an active hunter, if that makes sense. They're quite fast. But to give you an idea, I went looking for redbacks, which are obviously one of the most dangerous spiders in the world.
Yep.
And I spent a year in Australia, and in a year I found one redback spider.
Really?
And it was because I wanted to photograph it, and I literally couldn't get a photograph because it was in the most inaccessible place, and there's no way I was going to move it. So
no.
But yeah, no. I mean, there are funnel webs, and if you go north, there are sort of tarantula type things, and there are poisonous spiders, venomous spiders, but you really, a bit like the snakes, to be honest, they hear you coming. Well, in spiders' case, they feel you coming, and the same with snakes. They feel the vibrations. Most of them disappear. They don't want to be squished or, so. Other than huntsmen, I'd say most people wouldn't actually see spiders. You might see orb spiders, actually, to be honest, but they're harmless.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of the dangerous spiders in Australia. I've seen orbs and things like that.
If you go to the East Coast, particularly southern Queensland, northern Queensland, you get lots of orb spiders, but they're literally harmless. If you walk into the web, they'll just jump off the web, to give you an idea. So yeah, you really don't need to worry about spiders at all, in my opinion. Actually, I think Australia's got a really bad reputation as having all of these seriously dangerous animals, and on paper it absolutely does. But if you then look at the actual number of bites, and it's so low, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, very low.
I think last year more people were spurred by platypus than they were bitten by spiders or something, like sort of dangerously. So, because platypus venom is apparently very painful.
Yes, well, I imagine it is. Elaine says here, I went looking for spiders too, but was disappointed not to see any dangerous spiders, just huntsmen's and orb spiders, which is exactly what you said.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done. I've just got to get rid of something, and it's ridiculous, isn't it? I know we're live. I've got thing bleeping at me. Excuse me.
That's fine, don't worry. But yeah, so if anybody is afraid of Australia's sort of dangerous species, honestly, having spent a year there and actively seeking them out, they're a lot harder to find than everyone likes to make you think. You're more likely to get attacked by a kangaroo.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yeah, or a magpie or something. One of these.
Yeah, well, yeah, dive bomb by a magpie in breeding season. Yeah, definitely.
Hey, look, Bret, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I think as we have gone past 8:30, probably time to draw a close. However, I will read one or two, as I do tend to do towards the end of these presentations these days, one or two of the comments. Excellent presentations over the past few months. This is from Neil. Congratulations to everybody. From Hillary, another amazing talk and photographs. Thank you. From Peter, stunning presentation, Bret. So many superlatives. Can't wait to go.
Thanks, Peter.
That's a nice way to end, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks.
How about that? Hey, look, everybody, keep an eye out on our website. Keep an eye on your emails, and you will soon see another talk series that we've got coming up. We'll make some changes and variations. Do please email us, whether you want to email me or Bret or Sue or Dan or Nick or anybody. Please chuck a few ideas at us. We've got lots of our own. But we're going to take a break for a couple of weeks, and we look forward to seeing you again at the beginning of June. Thanks, Bret. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks.